Hi there, my name's Chris Bishop and this is my paper, Considerations for Selecting Field-Based Strength and Power Fitness Tests to Measure Asymmetries. Firstly, just a quick thanks to my co-authors for all their hard work in helping me get this up to scratch, which was accepted in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. A little bit of background in that my PhD that I'm currently undertaking is looking at asymmetries and their effects on physical performance or KPIs in a performance setting. We've chosen to try and keep it specific to key S&C principles by having a strength and power focus. Now, this paper was a review article, and it was very much trying to just outline a few considerations or a few key guidelines for practitioners if they did want to quantify asymmetries, so that hopefully the data that they get is arguably a little bit more meaningful, perhaps. So we focused on strength tests first, and we had three kind of key factors that we wanted to investigate. The first one being reliability. Now, of course, we can quantify strength from a whole range of tests, such as the back squat, isometric mid-thigh pull, iso squat, or even isokinetic dynamometry. Now, whilst the back squat is very commonly programmed for athletes, it should probably be kind of, highlighted that actually to do that well, we need a very large range of motion and mobility. And then athletes also need to be able to hold their form within those deep ranges of motion during that test. And whilst that should always be desirable, I'm not totally convinced that A, athletes can always do that, and B, if they can, I think that quantifying asymmetries from a test like that is probably only really particularly useful at the higher end, okay, sort of at 90% plus of their projected maximum. And with that in mind, that might not always be conducive to a given phase of training for athletes. Similarly, isokinetic dynamometry can provide us with some really useful information. We can get asymmetries in torque, we can get that at varying different velocities, and whilst that might be really useful, it is restricted to a laboratory setting, and it is restricted to an isolated joint action, which again is not particularly conducive to the dynamic actions that athletes perform during their sport when they compete. When you add on to the fact that it's probably very time consuming, we're trying to look for some middle ground maybe between those two. So what we've suggested is that an isometric mid-thigh pull or iso squat could be useful. Now, metrics such as peak force and mean force have been shown to be highly reliable. There's been a few questions asked about rate of force development, and more recently some literature's highlighted that metrics such as impulse and perhaps at different time points should be considered as well. The second consideration was looking at the effects on athletic performance. So, does a test, is there any association with any sort of key markers of physical performance? I'm not really going to spend too long on this because I've been fortunate enough to have a systematic review published last summer on this. So if anyone's interested on this effects on athletic performance section, there's a much more thorough outline of this in my systematic review. So if anyone's interested, I would just encourage you to go onto ResearchGate. And the third factor was athlete requirements. And I guess whilst this is somewhat tailored for before we even start with an athlete by looking at the needs of their sport, the needs of that individual, we put a little bit of a focus on whether we should be testing our athletes bilaterally or unilaterally. And I guess that's probably, in some instances, it should be relatively obvious, where a powerlifter probably needs to be tested for asymmetries in strength, if it's deemed warranted, of course, during a bilateral test, because that's very much what they do. However, in field sport athletes or team sport athletes, where there's perhaps no obvious distinction between bilateral or unilateral, perhaps both or maybe even unilateral could be suggested. There is a suggestion to say that during unilateral tests, there is obviously no contribution from the other limb, And we have suggested, we're definitely not claiming, but we've suggested that this might be a more accurate reflection of true asymmetries, given that there's no contribution for the other limb. We followed the exact same process for jump testing, looking at reliability first. And a lot of jump tests and varying different metrics within those tests have been proven to be highly reliable. What I would say is that particularly for field sport athletes, team sport athletes, court sport athletes, a lot of their movement patterns are multi-directional. So I think we want to ensure that whether we're looking at asymmetries or not, perhaps our jump testing should reflect that as well. Similarly, with the effects on athletic performance, there's been a couple of papers that have highlighted some negative associations, with performance if asymmetries are bigger, and equally for every paper that has indicated that there might be a negative association, there's another paper that suggests maybe there isn't. So again, I would encourage people to take a look at my systematic review. There's a little bit of information on interpreting asymmetry scores. Some dated information or some relatively older literature, I should say, has highlighted that 15% is a threshold where athletes might be kind of exposed to heightened injury risk. But I think what we do know as we start to look at this more now is that asymmetries are very test specific. They're probably very metric specific within those tests. They're direction specific if we think about multi-directional jumping as an example, and they're probably also population specific. So I think to classify one threshold as being a target for heightened injury risk is probably a bit too simplistic. And then to finish, we've suggested a test battery if people are looking to quantify asymmetries for strength and jumping tests. And whilst the athlete requirements will, somewhat dictate those tests, what I would say to finish is that unless people are using isokinetic dynamometry, of course, if people want to quantify asymmetries from the mid-thigh pull or the iso squat or indeed the back squat, force plates and twin force plates will almost certainly need to be used. However, for jump tests, whilst force plates will of course still be desirable, because we get a whole load more metrics, it is worth pointing out that that won't be in everyone's budget. And so asymmetries can still be quantified from unilateral tests off of jump mats or even mobile phone applications now. So we'd always encourage practitioners, even on smaller budgets, to consider adding that into their testing repertoire, because it may have may help guide some targeted training interventions potentially in the future.